It begins with a child's game, a carefree moment in a city still breathing the fresh air of revolution. New York, 1788. A young boy, playing near the imposing walls of the New York hospital, decides to peek through a window of the anatomy theater. What he sees will not only shatter his innocence, but will ignite a firestorm that engulfs the entire city. He doesn't see a medical lesson. He sees a dismembered arm hanging from a rope. And in a moment of pure, cold terror, he thinks he recognizes it. It looks, hauntingly, like the arm of his recently buried mother. This single, horrifying glimpse was the spark. But the powder keg had been filling for years, fueled by a dark secret the city's elite desperately tried to conceal. This isn't just the story of a riot. It's an investigation into a ghoulish underground economy built on grief, a war between scientific ambition and human dignity, and the moment when the people of New York rose up to fight their own doctors over the bodies of their dead. Welcome to Murky History, where we unearth the stories that lie buried beneath the official record. These narratives take months of research and investigation to bring to light. If you believe they deserve to be told, consider subscribing to join our journey into the shadows. In the late 1780s, New York City was a portrait of ambition. Having shed its role as a British colonial outpost, it was now the capital of the newly formed United States. The air buzzed with talk of progress, of building a new world founded on reason and enlightenment. Families began to post watches over the graves of their loved ones, standing guard through the cold nights with muskets and clubs. In the churchyards of prominent congregations like Trinity Church, families would pay for guards or organize their own vigils, a desperate attempt to protect the sanctity of their dead. The official story spoke of progress and enlightenment, but for a growing portion of the city's population, that progress felt like a predatory threat. The first crack in the facade of civility wasn't a single event. It was this creeping, pervasive dread. It was the dawning realization that the bodies of the poor and marginalized were being treated as raw material for the ambitions of the rich and educated. The trust between the people and the medical establishment was eroding, one stolen body at a time, creating a deep, simmering resentment that needed only a single, terrible catalyst to explode. The city wasn't just divided by class and wealth. It was divided between those who dissected and those who were dissected. At the heart of this intellectual fervor was the city's medical community. Institutions like Columbia College, which had re-established its medical school after the war, and the New York Hospital were seen as beacons of modern science. To the public, they were symbols of a brighter, healthier future. The men who ran these institutions were pillars of society. But in the shadows, a different story was being whispered, a story of fear and violation. For the common people of New York, the sailors, the artisans, the laborers, the free black community, and the poor, the city's cemeteries were becoming places of anxiety. The most vulnerable resting places were the potter's field and the African burial ground, where the graves were often shallow and poorly guarded. A terrifying rumor began to circulate, a word spoken with a mix of dread and anger. Resurrection men, night prowlers, ghouls in the employ of the medical schools, who stalked the city's graveyards with shovels and hooks, stealing the recently deceased from their final rest. Richard Bailey, a prominent surgeon and health officer, was a respected figure. He, along with his colleagues and a growing class of medical students, championed the importance of anatomical study. They argued, quite reasonably, that to heal the living, one must first understand the dead. Dissection was not a morbid curiosity, it was a scientific necessity. The official narrative, printed in pamphlets and discussed in educated circles, was one of brave men of science pushing the boundaries of knowledge for the betterment of all mankind. They were fighting disease, improving surgical outcomes, and training the next generation of physicians who would save countless lives. The practice of dissection was framed as a noble, if slightly unpleasant, part of this grand project. This was the story told in the light. This wasn't mere superstition. It was a horrifying, open secret. To understand the fury that was about to be unleashed, we have to dig deeper into the system that created the Resurrection Men. The demand for cadavers was high, driven by legitimate scientific need. The father, a bricklayer, gathers his friends and neighbors. They march to the cemetery. Their worst fears are confirmed. His wife's coffin is empty. The personal grief of one family now becomes the collective outrage of a community. A mob forms, armed not with military weapons, but with the tools of their trades: hammers, shovels, paving stones. They march on the New York hospital. The legal supply was virtually non-existent. What they find is a scene from a nightmare, a grisly museum of human suffering. They find multiple bodies in various states of dissection. Limbs, organs, and flayed skin are on display. The mob's fury turns incandescent. They don't just see scientific specimens. They see their stolen neighbors, friends, and family. They carry the discovered body parts out into the street, a horrifying parade of evidence for the entire city to witness. They destroy what anatomical and surgical preparations they can find, a symbolic act of reclaiming dignity for the dead. The action is no longer rising, it has erupted. The news spreads, and the mob swells, its anger now turning from the institution to the individuals. They begin to hunt for the doctors and the medical students, their names shouted in the streets as the city descends into chaos. And so, an illicit market was born. Medical students, often from wealthy families, and their professors, created the demand. The Resurrection Men provided the supply. These weren't just students on a late-night dare. They were often professionals, gravediggers or cemetery workers who knew the layout of the grounds and the schedules of the watchmen. They developed ruthlessly efficient techniques. They wouldn't waste time and energy unearthing an entire coffin. Instead, they would dig a shaft down to the head of the coffin, use a tool to pry open the lid, and then use ropes or a hook to pull the body out, leaving the coffin and the grave clothes behind to avoid being charged with larceny of property. The body itself, legally, had no owner. Why was this ghoulish trade not just present, a conveyor belt of the dead, moving from the potter's field to the dissection table? The students and doctors who participated rationalized their actions as a necessary evil, a morally gray act in the service of a greater good. But to the families of the stolen, it was the ultimate violation, a desecration that denied their loved ones a peaceful rest and, for many, jeopardized their soul's journey in the afterlife. The anger wasn't just about the physical act, it was about the profound injustice. It was always the bodies of the poor, the unconnected, the forgotten, that fueled this engine of progress, but thriving. The answer lies in a simple, yet profound, legal and ethical bottleneck. The law at the time was incredibly restrictive. In New York, as in most of the Western world, the only bodies legally available for dissection were those of executed criminals. This was intended as a final, post-mortem punishment, a terror to evildoers. But for the burgeoning medical schools of the late 18th century, it was a logistical nightmare. The number of executions was tiny compared to the number of students who needed to learn anatomy. A single cadaver might be used by dozens of students, but it wasn't nearly enough. This created a classic supply and demand problem. This was the dark engine running beneath the city. This simmering rage finds its flashpoint on Sunday, April 13, 1788. The story of the boy at the hospital window spreads like wildfire. They smash down the doors and surge into the anatomy theater. The revelation that crystallized over the next 48 hours was not simply that body snatching was happening. The people already knew that. The true, earth-shattering revelation was the scale, the brazenness, and the implicit sanction of the entire medical establishment. Mayor James Duane, a respected figure, tries to calm the crowds, but is met with stones and jeers. The city's doctors and students, now terrified for their lives, have gone into hiding. The soldiers, armed with muskets and bayonets, form a line between the jail and the thousands of furious citizens. An order is given, a volley of shots rings out. The crowd, armed with rocks and clubs, is met with lead. The first rioters fall, dead or dying. The sound of gunfire turns the protest into a slaughter. Screams of pain replace shouts of anger. The mob breaks and flees, leaving behind a street stained with the blood of at least 3, and perhaps as many as 8, of its own. The climax is not a victory for either side. It's a tragedy. It's the moment when the state, in its effort to protect the elite and restore order, fired upon its own people who were rioting against a genuine and profound injustice. The Doctors' Riot had reached its bloody, brutal conclusion. A group of them, including Richard Bailey, seek refuge in the city jail not as prisoners, but for protection. This tactical retreat fundamentally changes the nature of the conflict. The mob's focus now shifts from scattered houses to a single, symbolic target, the jail. They see it not as a sanctuary, but as the authorities protecting the guilty elite from popular justice. They surround the building, their numbers swelling into the thousands, as the mob rampaged through the city, targeting the homes of prominent physicians like Richard Bailey. It became clear this wasn't the work of a few rogue students. Governor George Clinton, John Jay, one of the nation's founding fathers, and Baron von Steuben, the famed Revolutionary War hero, arrive on the scene. They attempt to reason with the crowd, but the time for talk is over. The mob is convinced the authorities are hiding the doctors to help them escape. As Baron von Steuben pleads for calm, a rioter hurls a brick, striking him in the head and knocking him to the ground. The injury to the beloved war hero of the final straw. This was an industry. The sheer number of dissected remains found at the hospital proved that this was a systematic, ongoing operation, essential to the curriculum at Columbia. The doctors weren't just turning a blind eye. They were the architects of the demand that made the entire ghoulish enterprise profitable. The climax unfolds over 2 days of escalating violence. On Monday, April 14th, the city is in the grip of the mob. This is where the city's most powerful men are forced to intervene. Governor Clinton, seeing the situation spiraling into total anarchy, makes a fateful decision. He calls out the militia. In the immediate aftermath of the riot, the city was in shock. The authorities had won the battle in the streets, but they had lost the public's trust. The raw, violent outpouring of popular anger made one thing undeniable: the status quo was untenable. The practice of body snatching, and the law that inadvertently encouraged it, had to be addressed. The legacy of the Doctors' Riot was cemented less than a year later, in 1789, with the passage of an act to prevent the odious practice of digging up and removing for the purpose of dissection dead bodies buried in cemeteries or burial places. On the surface, this law seemed like a victory for the rioters. It explicitly outlawed body snatching, but this is where the dark history deepens. The law contained a crucial and deeply cynical provision. To solve the supply problem for the medical schools, the act legalized the dissection of the bodies of criminals executed for murder, arson, or burglary. More significantly, it also gave anatomists the right to take any unclaimed bodies from the city's jails and poor houses. This was the true, lasting legacy of the riot. The horror of grave robbing was not eliminated, it was institutionalized. The burden was simply shifted, by law, from the general population onto the most powerless and voiceless segments of society. The poor, the mentally ill, the incarcerated, and the friendless were now, by legislative decree, the designated raw material for medical science. The law didn't solve the ethical dilemma, it merely laundered it through the state. It created a legal, two-tiered system of death, one where the bodies of the privileged were protected, and another where the bodies of the marginalized were considered public property for scientific use. This quiet, legal codification of inequality is perhaps even more chilling than the chaos of the riot itself. So why does a 230-year-old riot over stolen corpses still matter today? Because the fundamental questions it raises have never gone away. The Doctors' Riot forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Progress often has a price, and historically, that price has been paid by those with the least power to refuse. It stands as a stark reminder that the pursuit of knowledge, if untethered from a profound respect for human dignity, can become a monstrous thing. The battle fought with paving stones and muskets on the streets of 18th century New York is still being fought today, in our labs, our hospitals, and our legislative halls. The story of the Doctors Riot is a powerful historical precedent for some of the most contentious ethical debates in modern medicine and science. It's an early chapter in the long, and often sordid, history of medical research exploiting vulnerable populations. Think of the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study, where African American men were deliberately left untreated to study the progression of the disease. Think of Henrietta Lacks, a poor black woman whose cancer cells were harvested without her consent in 1951 and became one of the most important cell lines in medical history, generating billions of dollars while her family remained in poverty. The echoes are everywhere, in debates over informed consent, in the global black market for organs, and in the distrust that many marginalized communities still harbor towards the medical establishment. We began with a child-esque glimpse into a window and followed the trail of horror to a city-wide riot, a bloody confrontation, and a legal solution that enshrined inequality into law. The Doctors' Riot was more than just a historical anomaly. It was a raw, unfiltered expression of a timeless conflict. When the noble pursuit of knowledge clashes with the fundamental value of human dignity, where do we draw the line? And perhaps more importantly, who gets to draw it? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this investigation valuable, please like this video, share it, and subscribe to Murky History for more deep dives into the shadows of our past. It revealed the dark underbelly of scientific progress and showed that when people feel their most sacred values are being violated, they will fight back with everything they have. The story serves as a permanent, cautionary mark in the history of medicine. It leaves us with a question that is as relevant now as it was in 1788.